Today we're looking at still supply and demand, but we're looking at how prices act as signals in the market economy. So the role of prices in resource allocation. We'll examine how shortages and surpluses impact prices, and we'll tell the story of these market mechanisms. Some of you may have seen the introductory video on Adam Smith with the invisible hand, but really what we were focusing on, if I may quote, by pursuing his own interest, he frequently, meaning like one in the economy, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So by acting in your own self-interest, often you are actually benefiting society as a whole. So what is the invisible hand? And again, some of you may have seen the video iPencil or Milton Friedman's reference to the story of iPencil, where we look at how a pencil can come to be with various parts from around the world, of the wood from one place in the States to graphite from someplace else to rubber from someplace else to copper. How does it all come together to create the pencil? And this is, in essence, by the invisible hand, by everyone acting in their own self-interest. Rationing is a method of apportioning or parceling out resources among their very competing uses, as well as apportioning goods and services among households. And we will see as we move through this PowerPoint that rationing really occurs through the price mechanism. So how do we parcel out what resources are going where? And we have people competing for their uses, and we will see that as I said, it is the price mechanism which is so powerful. The market mechanism uses price rationing. This means prices that are freely determined in markets by the forces of supply and demand. So hopefully by now, before you've seen this PowerPoint, we've looked at demand, movements along the demand curve, determinants of demand, the same thing with supply and movements along the supply curve, determinants of supply, and where supply and demand intersect. And this is one of the key ideas, is looking at the forces of supply and demand and how they interact. At the market equilibrium, the buying and selling choices of all buyers and sellers are satisfied and are in balance. In other words, where the supply curve meets the demand curve. So the market mechanism through price rationing is known as the invisible hand of the market. In a market economy, prices and markets determine the allocation of resources. So if we look at those three basic economic questions, going way back to the activity we did with the Arctic survival, we looked at what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. And we're going to see that it's the price mechanism that answers these. So the what question of resource allocation is answered because firms will only produce those goods and services that consumers are willing and able to pay for. The how question of resource allocation is answered because firms will use the resources and technologies in their production process that they are willing and able to pay for. The for whom question of distribution is answered because consumers will buy the goods and services they are willing and able to pay for. This in turn depends on the prices at which they sell their resources to firms, because that is their income. As signals and incentives, prices guide resource owners, which we know are the households. Now we know the decisions on what and how many resources they will sell. So let's go back to the concept of sell. It is the resource owners or the households that control the capital, entrepreneurship, land and labor, and they determine what and how many of these things that they will sell. Consumers' decisions on what and how many goods and services they will buy, and firms' decisions on what and how many resources they will buy. And firms' decisions on what and how much of goods and services they will produce and sell. So how do prices work as signals and incentives? So we're going to look at this very specifically. We're going to look at it from the example of a product market, being strawberries. So let's look at the scenario where consumers decide they want to eat more strawberries because of their health benefits. So what will happen to the market for strawberries? What shifts? Well, we know demand will shift to the right, that demand will increase. So we see that demand is shifting from D1 to D2. But what would happen if price did not initially change with the increase in demand? So we know that with the first demand curve, that this is our equilibrium quantity. If price were to remain the same, and we now have a new demand curve, this would be our Q2. If we've got the quantity demanded being greater than the quantity supplied, all of this, so demand, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, this would be a shortage. So this is without price having adjusted. We know that ultimately price will go from here to here, because we've sort of examined that in the classroom without explaining why. But what happens when there's a shortage, because price has not yet changed, can take time, maybe a little bit of time, maybe a medium amount of time, maybe a longer amount of time, depending on the product. That in response to the shortage, we know that the price is going to be driven up to eliminate the shortage, because the shortage really doesn't accomplish much in the marketplace, up to this point here. So if price did not initially change with an increase in demand, there would be a shortage, as we looked at a moment ago. So if we look at the initial demand curve being here, so D1, we'll call this D2, we would have an initial quantity demanded, where demand intersected supply here, with a quantity demanded at 16. Once demand increased at the same price as $10, we would now demand 30. So at 30 units, between 16 and 30, there would be a shortage of 14 units. So that's why we have the shortage of 14 here. So with a shortage, there would be an upward pressure on price, and the price of strawberries will continue to rise until the shortage, which we discussed would be 14, has disappeared. This will be the price of the equilibrium of the new demand curve and the original supply curve. So here's the new demand curve, the original supply curve, and the new price now being $17, which would eliminate the shortage of 14, which was created by the price initially not adjusting, of 14 units, of the price originally not adjusting with the new demand. So what ends up happening? We know that the price is going to go up from the initial price to the new price, which is here. But we've got two movements happening. We have to be careful along which curves we're talking about. If we look at the supply curve here, the higher price signaled to producers that there was a shortage in the strawberry market. The increase in price is also an incentive for producers to increase the quantity of strawberries supplied, so production is more profitable. So we've increased production from this point to this point in response to the higher price. And so if we think of the law of supply, we're thinking as price increases, quantity supplied increases, and lo and behold, we did with this increase here. If we look at the new demand curve, so we would have been reacting here to the old price with the new demand curve, but now price has risen to eliminate the shortage. With the new higher price, it's a signal and incentive for consumers, and it signals that strawberries are more expensive, and it is an incentive for them to buy fewer strawberries. So instead of buying this quantity here, they are now reacting and buying fewer with the new demand curve in response to the higher price. The increase in the price of strawberries resulted in a reallocation of resources. More resources are now allocated to strawberry production. So the economic question of what, more strawberries, how, and for whom. This has been answered, the what question of resource allocation. How do prices work as signals and incentives? As an example from a resource market, we're going to look at the labor market. So scenario, let's say we have substantial immigration and it causes the supply of labor to increase. So what shifts? We're going to have the supply, curve for labor shifts right, so supply increases. So if we look at the labor market, we have price of labor or wages over here. We've got the quantity of labor over here, and we have the supply increasing from S1 to S2. So we've had immigration happen. This was initially the wage equilibrium was there, but now we have an increase in supply and the wages have not yet adjusted. So what would happen if the price of labor did not initially change with the increase of labor? Well, here we've got the equilibrium quantity, but here we've got a new supply or quantity supplied of labor. If we have more supply than demand, we have now a surplus. So a surplus of labor, and in the labor market we refer to that as unemployment. If there's an increase in the supply and the price or the wage of labor did not initially decrease, there would be a surplus of labor. Also, as I mentioned, for the labor market would be unemployment of labor. The surplus now, because a surplus is in really no one's interest, is going to cause the wage rate to start falling. It's going to put a downward pressure on price or on wage. And it will keep falling until the labor surplus has disappeared. So at this point, we had the surplus. If at this point we get to a new equilibrium of the supply and demand curve here, there will no longer be a surplus. So the supply was initially here. If we call this S1 and this is S2, as the supply increased, we had the surplus, and the wage would fall until we reach the new equilibrium. So if we look at it in terms of supply and demand, the falling wage rate acted as a signal to firms. So these are firms that demand labor. So you have to put on a different hat now. Instead of it being the consumers that have the demand curve, it's now the firms that have the demand curve. So there was a surplus in the labor market, and it acted as an incentive to lower wages, to hire more labor because of the lower wages, and we had movement along the labor demand curve. As I said, we're looking at the demand curve because it's the firm's demand for labor. So if we look at that, this is where we are moving along the demand curve for labor. So demand for labor. In terms of the suppliers of labor, which means you and me and anyone else in the labor market, the lower wage is a signal to workers to offer less of their services at the lower wage rate. So we have a movement along this new supply curve to the equilibrium. Both firms and workers have responded to the signals and incentives provided by prices. This has resulted in a reallocation of labor resources as firms are now producing output with a larger quantity of labor. So the economic question about how with more labor. So this has answered the question of how in terms of the resource allocation. So a little tester. What would happen in the market if the price were above the equilibrium? So we could think quantity of, let's say, good A. We've got price of good B. So how you want to figure out what's happening is, let's look at what's intersecting with what. So here's the new price, or here is the price, excuse me, intersecting with the demand curve. So this is going to be our QD. Here is the price, again, intersecting with our supply curve. So this will be QS. If we have a quantity supplied which is greater than the quantity demanded, we're going to have a surplus. With a surplus, the price is going to be driven down to reach the new equilibrium. We're going to have two movements. So let's put this as QE2. We're going to have two movements, one along the demand curve, demanding more. So the quantity demanded has increased because the price has decreased according to the law of demand. And then we have movement along the supply curve where the quantity supplied is going to be less because according to the law of supply, if price decreases, quantity supplied will decrease. So we have one, the price being lowered to eliminate the surplus, and two, the response of consumers demanding more because of the decrease in price, and we have suppliers or producers supplying less because of the decrease in price. And the last tester, what would happen in the market if the price were below the equilibrium? So if the price were here, again, let's look at what this is intersecting. This is intersecting the supply curve, so this must be QS. This here is intersecting the demand curve, so this must be QD. If we have greater quantity demanded than quantity supplied, this must be a shortage. What would happen with a shortage? The price would be driven up until the shortage is eliminated. We would have two movements along the curve. If the price is increasing, and here is our new QE2, if the price is increasing, we're moving along the supply curve in a response to a higher price supplying more, which according to the law of supply. And in terms of demand, with a higher price, we are demanding less because the law of demand, reaching the new equilibrium quantity at the new price to eliminate the shortage. Thank you.